Hello, my name is Magnus Petersen. This talk is about share buyback valuation and in particular details about the relative value. I recommend that you watch the first video on share buyback valuation, and just to briefly recap, the value without a share buyback is the excess cash plus the present value of future earnings that can be paid out as dividends. The value after dividend tax and per share is denoted capital V. The value with a share buyback is defined as follows. The share buyback reduces the amount of cash that can be paid out as dividends, and it reduces the number of shares. The value with a share buyback after dividend tax and per share is denoted capital W. The relative value of a share buyback is found by taking the value with a share buyback, denoted capital W, and divided by the value without a share buyback, which is denoted capital V. So we take the definitions from the previous slides and we reduce and we get this formula here. As an example, consider the company Acme Corporation, and we will assume that the market cap is $150 billion. The buyback amount is assumed to be $60 billion, which is 40% of the market cap. We will consider different degrees of mispricing between the intrinsic value V and the market cap of all shares. First, consider a mispricing of 20%. So on this plot, we have the intrinsic value on this axis here, and it goes from 0 to $300 billion. In the middle, we have $150 billion, and this is assumed to be the market cap. We note this with a circle up here, and on the other axis, we have the relative value of the share buyback, and when it is 100%, we have equilibrium, which is where the share buyback does not affect the value to long-term shareholders. So when the intrinsic value equals the market cap, it is in equilibrium. For a 20% mispricing, the intrinsic value can either be 20% above the market cap or 20% below. So if it is 20% above the market cap, the intrinsic value V would be $180 billion. And if the intrinsic value is 20% less than the market cap, then the intrinsic value is $120 billion. What you should note here is the shape of the curve. When the intrinsic value is above the market cap, the curve rises gently. And when the intrinsic value is below the market cap, the curve decreases quite quickly. So in the case where the intrinsic value is really 20% above the market cap, we have a relative value of 111%, which means the gain to shareholders from making the share buyback is 11%. On the other hand, if the intrinsic value is 20% less than the market cap, then the relative value is 83%, which means a loss to shareholders of 17% for making the share buyback. We have the formulas out here. So we have the capital W divided by capital V, and the formula from the previous slide. We plug in the numbers. The buyback amount is assumed to be $60 billion. The intrinsic value is $120 billion. The buyback amount again, and the market cap, which was assumed to be $150 billion. We calculate this, and out comes 83%, like we have written over here. And we calculate the same for the other scenario. Now consider a 40% mispricing, so the intrinsic value is either $210 billion or $90 billion. So in case of a gain, the gain is only 19%, but the loss is 44%. So even though the mispricing is either 40% above or 40% below, the gain is much smaller than the loss. Now consider a 60% mispricing, so the intrinsic value is either $240 billion or $60 billion. So in case of $240 billion, the share buyback would give a gain to shareholders of 25%. It is calculated with the formula out here. In case the intrinsic value is really only $60 billion, the relative value is 0, which means a loss of 100%. So it is calculated out here, and as we can see, the buyback amount is $60 billion, the intrinsic value is $60 billion, so this number here comes to 1, which means this number here is 0, and hence the entire value is 0. What this means is that all the value to shareholders is lost. This is because the market cap is $150 billion, but the intrinsic value of the company to shareholders is only $60 billion. We make the share buyback for excess cash, and the share buyback was for $60 billion. So the intrinsic value is all excess cash, and we use it all for a share buyback. So the market cap is also decreased by $60 billion, so the market cap becomes $90 billion after the share buyback, but there's no more value in the company. The intrinsic value has gone to 0. So even though the market cap after the share buyback is $90 billion, the intrinsic value is 0, and hence the relative value of the share buyback is 0, which is a total loss, or a loss of 100%. Now consider the relative value for an 80% misprice. So either the intrinsic value is $270 billion, or the intrinsic value is $30 billion. So if the intrinsic value is $270 billion, it comes out to a gain of 30% from making the share buyback. But if the intrinsic value is only $30 billion, then we have a loss of 267%. So what is happening here is that we have a relative value that is a negative 167%. This is because we plug in the buyback amount of $60 billion, the intrinsic value of only $30 billion, which is smaller than the buyback amount, and the market cap is $150 billion. So this comes out to minus 167%. The intrinsic value V is smaller than the buyback amount. So this means that in order to make this buyback, we would have to borrow another $30 billion. In the treatise, I go into a long discussion whether this formula is even appropriate for such a recapitalization where we borrow money to make a share buyback. But one thing is certain, and that is that if we do borrow money to make a share buyback, and it turns out that the intrinsic value is a lot less than the market cap, then we destroy a tremendous amount of shareholder value. Now let us consider what happens when we vary the buyback amount. So we will again assume that the market cap is $150 billion. Now the intrinsic value is assumed to be either $120 billion or $180 billion, which means a 20% mispricing compared to the market cap. And the buyback amount varies. First, consider a buyback amount of $15 billion, which is 10% of the market cap. So we again have the axis down here with the intrinsic value. We assume that the market cap was $150 billion, which is marked by this circle, where we have equilibrium, which means the relative value of the share buyback is 100%. So the share buyback doesn't change the value to shareholders. So the mispricing is either 20% above the market cap, which is $180 billion, or 20% below the market cap, which is $120 billion. In which case, the share buyback would give a loss of 3% or a gain of 2%. Now let's increase the buyback amount, so now it is 20% of the market cap. Now for the case where the intrinsic value is 20% above the market cap, the share buyback would give a gain to shareholders of 4%. If the intrinsic value is 20% below the market cap, we would have a loss of 6%. Let's increase the buyback amount further. Now it's $60 billion. And in this case, we would have a gain of either 11% or a loss of 17%. So again, you should note that the gain is smaller than the loss. Now the buyback amount is really large. It's $120 billion. The market cap is $150 billion. So if the intrinsic value is 20% above the market cap, which is $180 billion, then the buyback would give a gain to shareholders of 67%. If the intrinsic value is really 20% less than the market cap, that is, the intrinsic value is $120 billion, which is all of the buyback amount, then the loss is 100%. And this is similar to one of the previous slides because the market cap is $150 billion, but we use all the company's excess cash to buy back shares. So we buy back shares for $120 billion. Then there's no more intrinsic value left in the company, but the market cap is still $30 billion. So we have destroyed all the value with the share buyback. Now consider the case where the buyback amount is greater than the intrinsic value. So the intrinsic value is $120 billion, but the buyback amount is $127.5 billion. In this case, the relative value of a share buyback is minus 42%, and it is calculated in the formula out here. And this means a loss to shareholders of 142%. Again, this is not completely well defined mathematically, but what we can see is that the buyback amount is greater than the intrinsic value. So we destroy all the value to shareholders, and we destroy more than that because we have to borrow money to make a share buyback. This is also called a recapitalization. So let's look at the opposite case where we have the intrinsic value is $180 billion, which is 20% greater than the market cap. Then the gain to shareholders is 94%. So the value to shareholders is almost doubled from the share buyback. What you should note is how this relative value curve changes with a changing share buyback amount. So if we decrease the buyback amount, go back through the slides, you will note that the curve becomes more flat. So here we have a buyback amount which is very large, still very large, but the curve becomes slightly flatter. And then even more flatter as the buyback amount decreases, flatter still. And finally, the curve is quite flat when the intrinsic value is roughly equal to the market cap, or the intrinsic value is above the market cap. Only when the intrinsic value is a lot less than the market cap does the curve decrease very steeply. So what this means is that when the buyback amount is fairly small and the intrinsic value is approximately equal or greater to the market cap, then the value to shareholders is not affected that much from a share buyback. But even with a small buyback amount, and if the intrinsic value is a lot less than the market cap, then there is a tremendous loss from making the share buyback. As the buyback amount increases, this effect becomes magnified in the sense that this steepness of the curve moves right on the plot, for example here, so that even though the intrinsic value is only slightly less than the market cap, the value destruction is quite big compared to the gain in shareholder value if the intrinsic value was greater. And still we have the same shape that once the intrinsic value becomes a lot less, the value destruction is immense. When the buyback amount is really large, the shareholder value is affected greatly for even small mispricings. We can make a plot of the relative value when we change both the buyback amount and the intrinsic value. So on this axis, we have the buyback amount in billions of dollars, and it goes from 0 to 150, and we assume that the market cap is 150. And on this axis, we have the intrinsic value, which goes from 0 to $300 billion. We have assumed that the market cap is $150 billion, so the equilibrium is where the intrinsic value equals the market cap, which is shown by this bold line on the plot. So here we have a relative value of 100%. On this part of the plot, we have losses. So if the intrinsic value is really less than the market cap, we have losses, and we see the nonlinear effect of changing both the buyback amount and the intrinsic value. And on this side of the plot, we have the gains, which is if the intrinsic value is greater than the market cap, we have these gains. What we have shown on the previous slides are cutouts from this plot by holding the buyback amount fixed. So a curve like this, and a curve like this, and a curve like this, and a curve like this are the ones we have shown on the previous plots. So what you should note here is the so-called nonlinear effect, that if we increase the buyback amount, the effect of a share buyback becomes magnified, especially when the buyback amount is really big or the intrinsic value is a lot less than the market cap. And what you should also note is that if the intrinsic value is greater than the market cap, so that we have a gain in shareholder value from making the share buyback, the gain is not that great. The curve here is not exactly flat, but it doesn't increase that greatly from making a share buyback at bargain prices, unless the buyback amount is really large. On the other hand, the losses quickly become very destructive if the intrinsic value is smaller than the market cap. This plot is made by taking the relative value formula from one of the previous slides and simply varying the variables in that formula. And I suggest that you try and make this plot yourself, because it's very instructive to do so, and you will understand the relative value a lot better. So you would take this formula here and put it into some kind of mathematical plotting program and make the buyback amount go from, for example, 0 to 150, the intrinsic value 0 to 300, and then fix the market cap at, for example, 150, and then you would get a plot like this. So the conclusion is that a share buyback of overpriced shares is much more destructive to long-term shareholder value than the gains from a buyback of underpriced shares. And this effect is even magnified as the buyback amount increases. This talk was based on 2 papers, the short one, which is good for an introduction, and the long treatise, which is much more detailed. They can be found on this website, and the links are also provided below this video.